Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who can be depended upon to really put in the effort into new theme music after 185 episodes.
Tim Longo. Yeah, well, I really nailed this one, huh?
You did.
I sourced it.
We complained about it for 4 years, and then
I found the person to do it. Nope, I didn't do any of that, everybody.
No.
As I think we've covered, again, thanks to Aaron Evers for really bringing it. You know, he just... we have lots of great fans, and he's one of our greatest, and he put his money where his mouth is, quite literally, and we thank him for doing my job.
Somebody's got to do it.
But yeah, so why don't you introduce our bonus episode guest?
Absolutely. Our guest tonight, he's worn a lot of different hats. He's unusual to the show in that he's not himself a game developer, but instead a musician by trade, though he has been in games journalism for years, stepping back from that over the last year to return to music composition and performance. It's hard to pinpoint for me exactly when I came across his writings, but certainly for me it started with something called Gamer Melodico, which was a blog about game music and other game things. And then I followed him to Kotaku, where he began as a staff writer before ultimately becoming an editor-at-large, a position he resigned from at the end of 2018. We're having him on because he's the composer of our new theme music, and he's a man with opinions about video game music. He's the creator and host of the Strong Songs podcast, which I wholeheartedly endorse, the co-host and producer of the Kotaku Split Screen podcast, along with Maddie Myers and Jason Schreier. Some folks may know him as Kirk Hammer. I remember him fondly as IDPL MAL, but he is, of course, Kirk Hamilton. Welcome to the show, Kirk.
Hello, what a wonderful introduction. Hi, Tim. Hi, Brett. I'm very happy to be here.
Did I miss anything? Is there any big thing that I missed there? Oh, and he composed our theme music. I guess I said that somewhere.
You said that, yeah. Right.
Yeah, okay.
But no, that was wonderful. That was a way better intro than I'll ever get in my life.
I'll totally take it. That was great.
I have to say, it's not in your list of music. We're going to jump around a bit, and I want to dive into the music for the cast. But I think the first thing I remember from you was a discussion of the Red Dead Redemption, the first one soundtrack.
Oh, man, yeah.
And how it, populated with incidental sounds like, birds crying and like the way the train was going, and they all kind of worked together and everything was rhythmically synced up, which is not something I would have heard. And I only mention that because that's the sort of thing that you talk about on your podcast, Strong Songs. Like, whenever you take apart a piece of music, I see and hear things that I've never heard before, or I'm introduced to music that I don't know very well, and get a very, very deep introduction. So I will thank you again for that podcast, as I have a million times. It's amazing.
Cheers. Yeah, that's the goal of the show. So that's good to hear. Like I feel like there was this period of time when I was mostly just doing video game stuff, writing about games, and I was a musician for a long time out of music school, and then sort of fell into this other career. And there was a minute where I was like, am I still a musician? I'm not playing much. I'm not doing stuff. And then I realized that because of the way I listened to music, because of music school and, a lot of ear training and learning how to hear everything, that would always be like, I could never play another note, and that would still be something that I would have. And so I kind of realized that's like one of the best things about having a music education. So that was always kind of my goal. It's okay, how do I take, a lot of ear training and then turn it into something that can be accessible for a lot of people? So that's fantastic to hear.
Yeah, no, it is. It's great. And it is a thing that, of course, I've not had that kind of training. I was a musician in high school.
A saxophone player, right?
I was also a saxophone player. I played piano for a lot of years, actually, leading up to that. I think I played piano for like 13, 14 years.
Oh, okay.
And a smattering of other stuff, a little bit of trumpet. But yeah, I mean, it's been years since I've picked up an instrument other than to move it across a room because my teen put it down somewhere it shouldn't be. But yeah, that saxophone's still here in the house, so I've been threatening myself to pick it up one of these days.
I think you should do it, but I know that you already know that. But I think your listeners should don't you want to hear Brett play some saxophone at some point on DGC?
Yeah,
some of them have on my Twitch stream. I played, so this is the funniest thing. The first time I ever met Kirk in the flesh, first time I've literally ever met this guy, I played for him a recording I had just gotten onto
I remember
iPhone.
This. Oh man, that's right.
Of a solo that I played way back, in 1989 or something. Yeah, and it was funny. You were still, I don't know if you had, it's not a thing I mentioned in the intro, but you also taught music for a while. I
did, yes.
And so it was really funny because you were like, oh, there's some things in here that I teach my students, like base your solo on the melody and whatever and things like that. So I totally remember every moment of that conversation.
I remember that too. That's such a good introduction. Like, that's a very winning way to introduce yourself to someone. This guy walks up to me at a restaurant and is like, hey, so here's a saxophone solo I played in high school.
I am bold in certain circumstances. But
it works for me anyway.
I played that for the Twitch stream once, so like 6 people have heard that. So
nice. All right.
Since 1989, I should
Lots
say.
of people have heard him sing though, so it could do both. Maybe a saxophone, singing sort of like combo.
Yeah, I mean,
saxophone is a lot like singing.
It is a lot of breath control.
That's true.
Let's move on from all that weird stuff that was totally random. I actually wanted to start. I'll start asking, because I wasn't part of this process at all. I guess I want to ask you, Kirk, like, how did Tim get you started? Really is my question. Like, what did he sort of say to you that, was it some music stuff? Like, how did the ball get rolling on writing a bit of music?
I'm trying to think. I feel like I should pull up Tim's initial email because I don't want to get him wrong. But the idea was basically, he described what the show was, which is, I've listened to the show, so I know it, but that it's kind of this like two people having smart conversations about games. So we're looking for something kind of sciencey and thoughtful, but with a video game-ish sound to it. And that was kind of where we started. I feel like, Tim, you can correct me here, but I feel like you gave me a pretty broad mandate.
Yeah, no, I uttered the NPR, examples, and we talked about sort of science NPR cast specifically, because there's sort of I don't know if it's a great descriptor, but there's a playfulness to a lot of those podcasts that are people that Radio Lab and things like that people know that are trying to be somewhat, well, Radio Lab specifically has a lot of academic feel to it and a lot of deep research being done that they present it in a fun way, and we would like to say that we do that, but we are kind of on the more academic side, a little bit in that little heady space. We go pretty deep on things, and so I was trying to describe that to Kirk as far as, it's not Fresh Air for sure, or
right.
This American Life, but it's in the NPR sort of milieu, and but then I think at the time, and this was really hot off the presses, I think in the initial email I also mentioned Castlevania,
right, Symphony of the Night,
and partially that was definitely, I'll admit, because it was hot off the presses. I think we had just finished that game, but I think
and it has great music.
It has great music, and I think because we're a sort of retro podcast as well, we do play some 2005 games or whatever, but generally we play older stuff, and that's sort of the point of it. So I felt like having a bit of a retro spin to it, not necessarily bit tunes, but retro feeling, right. Chip tunes or whatever, but something retro like that. So I think I cited Symphony of the Night a little bit too, but that was the kickoff, I think. Pretty much.
This process got me listening, first of all, to a lot of NPR jingles, which are super good, and I've always kind of thought that they were really good. But is it so Morning Edition? I think they did new music for it, but it used to be that like yep. Such a good jam, that one. And then it's is that All Things Considered? Ba, 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 ba. Yep. It's like a sax quartet playing that, and it ends on a sus chord. It's like
I think it's the World Saxophone Quartet, actually.
Who is it?
I think it's the World Saxophone Quartet.
The World Saxophone Quartet. That makes sense that it would be them. They're like maybe the only well-known saxophone quartet out there.
They're the only one I know. and
I've played
and
a
I
lot
remember
of
hearing them
quartets.
say it. Yeah.
Man, so sax quartet music is amazing for starters. Like, we had to do that in school. I was a saxophone player in school. I don't know if I actually mentioned that on the show. I was like talking to you about saxophone, but that's like my main instrument. And saxophone quartets are amazing, beautiful, kind of like ensemble. Nobody really hears saxophone quartets, but anyway, I've always loved that that's played by the sax quartet. And then I totally didn't like follow any of those styles when I was writing you guys' theme. It kind of wound up being, it was interesting. I think I sent Tim 2 different versions. There was one that was like a little more melodic. I was actually playing the melody for that one on an instrument called the aerophone, which is like an electronic saxophone, and it's pretty cool. This is like something I haven't recorded myself using much because I just bought one. But then we went with this other thing that was kind of, well, that's the theme music you guys now have, or at least it was the basis for it, which was like a groove I'd come up with for some other thing that I then never really used, and was sort of sitting there thinking like, this is kind of a cool little jam. What can I do with this? We went back and forth on it and sort of turned it into the theme that you guys now have, which was a fun process. I like writing jingles. I don't do a lot of it, but it's like a really condensed kind of composition. You need to have like an idea that's really short. You know, it's like, I don't know how long it is, something like 8 seconds or something at the beginning of the show. And that's a fun challenge, I think. And then the only other part of it that maybe your listeners will think is interesting was creating the sound of a retro game synth, you know, of like a sort of a chip processor.
Right. Yeah, I was curious about that.
I'm not like a synthesizer guy. I'm like an analog guy. I like record and play all my own instruments a lot of the time. And I'm getting more into doing electronic stuff, kind of like this theme music. It's really fun, but it's not my background. And of course, you both know Matthew Burns, right? I'm assuming that you
Yes, I know him. I don't know if Tim does.
You know Matthew.
I know of him, yeah. I don't know.
So he's a friend of mine, really great composer as well. He is the composer and writer at Zachtronics.
Yeah.
Just directed Eliza, a really cool game, and a friend of mine. And he had been showing me more stuff with synthesizers, and it's like just not something I had ever really learned, because I don't know, like I knew what they were, I knew how they worked, but to really sit down and be like, okay, every synthesizer is baseline the same instrument, and they all make different sounds and come from different places, but it's all just these series of parameters, you know, the waveform and the oscillators, and you start messing with them, and it gets pretty easy to actually create the sound of an old, you know, the same kind of synthesizers that they were using in old game consoles. So that was kind of a fun process too, is to come up with that sound to kind of be a little ornament. I didn't want you guys to have like another video game podcast with like chiptune music that's like your theme music, just because there's so many of those and that's not as interesting. But I did like adding that little flair to it. I thought it was kind of cool.
And I think and as Kirk said, he sent a couple over initially, and I think the other one that you had composed was, I think, nailing the sort of like the softer sort of NPR feel. You know,
yeah,
what I mean?
It had a little more jazzy thing going on.
Yeah, very jazzy, and it was also cool. But I think, and I think even some of our listeners may differ from me on this. And Brett, as I think we talked about, but just for listeners, essentially opted out. Like, it's not that Brett doesn't care. He just goes, hey, you two figure it out.
I hate music. I don't want to be involved.
He hates music. Yeah. Clearly, he procedurally created our previous one. So, you know, that's But it was.
Yes, I hit reload on a website multiple times. That's exactly.
I kind of like. I love that a computer came up with that music. That's really cool. Yeah.
I think it's super neat.
I totally did.
And that's Juke Deck, I think, is what it's called. So I don't know if I've ever said that on the cast, but it's just a thing, and it's like it's got a bunch of themes, and how long is it got to be, and whatever. And I just finally found like, okay, something in this area. Right? And then I just kept hitting reload and downloading what it would generate and go, not quite. You know, finally got one that I was like, okay, that's fine. Yeah. So anyway.
And I think it's still in some of our fans' hearts, right? And it will be. It's because it was the one we had for so long.
Oh, yeah. I mean, change of podcast theme music, and people always prefer the older music from time to time. I definitely don't take that personally. I wrote for Strong Songs. I did a whole thing where I was using like an old track for the theme music when I first started it, because I just hadn't had the time to write new music. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to do a whole thing. And I spent forever like writing this new theme and doing a big arrangement with like horns and stuff. And I put it out, and there are definitely people who are like, oh, I liked the old one. It's like, no, but the new one is new. Come on.
And I
Sleek Culture Gabfest has one now that was written by literally like an Oscar-winning composer.
Yeah, it's by the Succession guy. What's his name?
Yes,
yeah,
him,
like
exactly.
Like
yeah, right. Yeah, because he got a nomination for that recently, and they mentioned him.
I heard them. And I heard them shout him out.
I'm the same way where I go, yeah, but I missed the old one.
Yeah,
which wasn't
Nicholas
even supposed
Bertel
to be there.
Is his name. Yeah. Just for the record, Nicholas Bertel. He's amazing. Oh my God, his Succession music is so good. Don't get me started.
Well, I've heard it. I heard it on your podcast, so it's probably the only time I'll ever hear it. But you clipped a little in at some point.
He's so good.
There you go. Well, and I also, I think I mentioned this before, but I think it's very poetic that the way that the first theme was created in Brett's manner, and his programmer mind and brain, and then us going through this. So, but I mean, I think where I was just ending up with that little stream there was just, I just wanted some sort of some energy and some peppiness to it, that had, and so you like you said you had sent that other one almost as an alternate, like. They're two contrasting, essentially pieces. And I liked them both, but then I heard that one that you had sort of in your back pocket and was sort of like, part of your archives or whatever. And the one we ended up with, ultimately, or an earlier version of it. And just the energy, we're pretty low key as a podcast in general, but I would like to think that we're kind of in that sciencey kind of, we don't do heavy research as we often talk about, and, and we're not getting into super details, but sometimes we do. And we don't mind talking almost scientifically about game design and about how games are made. And so I felt like that was a fitting one for it. And once I heard that one, for me at least, I was like, oh yeah, that's it. That's the direction that I did. Not being a musician, I couldn't, it's always been hard for me as a creative director to direct musicians, as I told Kirk, because I don't have the terms, I don't know the right ways to talk to them about it. So all the composers I've worked with have been very patient with me, and I thank them all. So it's hard for me, right? I'm trying to give sort of high level stuff, but Kirk did an amazing job pulling it together.
I'm curious about that actually, Tim, like how that works when you're a creative director in a game. Like how like on what level, like how directly do you interface with composers? Was it sort of similar to what you and I did for this, or different?
It was, yeah, I think it's similar. I think ours was just obviously a very truncated version, but
well, yeah, right. You don't just do one phone call, like a quick email when you're making a AAA video game.
We just kind of batch, we just email pretty much. They're down the hall, but I still
do whatever.
Even though I will say part of it is that I enjoy it for sure, and I like being out of my element with composers, but music is such a critical part of games that I really like trying to be very heavily involved. I do reviews with them. We'll sit in the sound booth and talk about things. And most of the time, all the stuff that Brett loves about working with me and designers, we're talking about, intangibles, right? Emotion, themes, thematic stuff. Even if we're talking about a specific, like we would do level reviews, right? And we would talk about the music for a level and talk about the way that the cadence for the level should be. And, usually the level designer would be there, what have you. So I like to be involved, but to be honest, I'd try to stay in my lane as well. It's really more sort of like thematic and tonal aspects of whether it's fitting or not, but I try to obviously give them the space to put their own creative stamp on it too. So I think in our sort of the way that we in high level, I gave you some high level sort of like, thoughts. We often start there, and they're asking a lot of questions about story or whatever, and I've only worked on sort of the bigger games, so we have big teams, right? So it's I don't get enough time with them for sure. So they're trying to mine as much as they can from the rest of the design team. So
it's an interesting place to be in, I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I was going to say is that for the most part, Tim has worked with IPs that have already got soundtracks to them to some degree, right? So,
right, I guess that's true. There's like established music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a bunch of Star Wars games, and then I guess, Tomb Raider, right? So stuff there. I mean, there were themes. I'm sure there was new music in that. Well, I don't specifically remember, but
the reboot,
and then of course Halo. So
and that's a really good point too. I mean, not to dwell on this too much because I want to definitely get back to Kirk, but
I don't know. I'm interested in it, but sure.
When we're working with big licenses, the interesting thing about conversations with the composers often are kind of revolving around what are we going to change and how are we going to keep the spirit, but also add freshness, and that actually goes with every part of the game, right? That even goes with gameplay. That goes with visual, art direction, and all of these directors that work for me are. I'm not an artist either, right? But I have to talk to them about how are we going to evolve Tomb Raider, or something like that. And the reboot was obviously the biggest shift away from the IPs that I worked with, because it was a reboot. So
that was Jason Graves, right? Was the composer on that?
That's
man. He brought in. There's like that one crazy instrument that he plays on it. It's like some like death bassoon or something. It's just like
yeah. Well, and I think one of the main ones that he used, he created, right? Isn't that his thing?
Yeah, I think he built it. Yeah. That's a great soundtrack on that game.
We actually had a few composers on that we and Jason ended up being the final one, but because we were trying to find the musical composition for that. That whole project was an exploration, right? Because how do you reboot that thing?
Right.
But then with I will say with Republic Commando, and I actually talked to him recently. Jesse was a composer on that. We intentionally sort of broke Star Wars as much as we possibly could that people would let us, because it had a different tone, and so it wasn't as Williams as you would think, for those who haven't played Republic Commando. And that was Jesse. Jesse and I talked about and David Collins, who was our audio director.
And Jesse Harlan.
Jesse Harlan, sorry. Yep.
Right. Also his wife, I believe, helped him with the language stuff for the Mandalorian music.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Cool.
Vodeon,
something like that. I forget what it's called, but something like that.
They had choral aspects to the music that they created and then recorded in the language of the Mandalorian.
Oh, so this is in Mandalorian, but not the Mandalorian music for the new TV show, The Mandalorian.
It was in the language.
That was Ludwig Göransson did that, but yeah.
No, this was far.
Right, on Republic Commando. Got it.
But anyway, point being is that there's times when, even with licensed music or, with licensed IPs, that we're trying to break things a little bit. But yeah.
Yeah, neither did I. But the other part of that, and this has kind of jarred me, and it's maybe a good way to segue into the second half of the conversation, but is, of course, in a game, the player is directing the music to some degree, right? We all look back and lament, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a game that the music just repeated and repeated and repeated. But I want to say,
any JRPG, right?
Right, a JRPG, for example, but even there, it's like you're going into different states. But I'm thinking more of like a real-time strategy game or something, where it's like you're playing this one map for an hour and you're just hearing the same stupid song repeat, 20 times, because it's a 3-minute clip if you're lucky, and it's in MIDI besides, so it just, your brain is melting. And one of the things that, and this is what jarred my memory about it, was with Jesse's music, there was a lot more, for Republic Commando, there was a lot more stingers, and the way he put the music together was more like that Red Dead Redemption piece that you had written years ago, where it was based on things that were happening. He had lots of sort of logical triggers, and then we had written a system Michelle Henners had done that was similar to... I forget what it was called, iMUSE, something like that, that LucasArts had.
Yeah,
it was iMUSE.
Yeah, so she had kind of implemented a lot of the functionality from iMUSE to work in Unreal, and that basically allowed those things to be scheduled so they'd fit together. So there was that aspect as well. So I think it's a good time to sort of transition into your own sort of video game music. One of the things we asked Kirk to do was come up with some retro games, or just games that he thinks of fondly as far as music goes, and these are all on the older side. Why don't you take us into your sort of like your entry level drugs? I've kind of given you the entry there with some mention of LucasArts.
Yeah, that's funny too, especially because one of the first times I can remember noticing iMUSE, it wasn't actually because was it in the second Monkey Island where they use that it's like when you're walking around in the town, I think they use it there.
Yeah,
and
I think that's right.
So and there's this like really amazing thing where they go back and forth between different instruments, especially in the HD versions, because there are actual musicians playing. So they'll kind of end their little trombone solo or whatever as you walk out into the next area. Like the segues are really smooth. But it was actually in Dark Forces, which I didn't even put on the sheet that I sent to you guys. But I remember that Dark Forces, I believe it was the first one and not the second one. I think it was the first used iMUSE. So like the John Williams score would get really exciting when it was time to have a fight. But then when the fight was over, it would transition away from that. And I remember noticing that. I was pretty young at the time, but just being impressed by it, thinking, oh, this is so cool. It's like, I'm in a movie that's being scored by someone actively, according to what I do, which was a really cool thing to notice. But on the LucasArts tip, so I didn't have game consoles growing up. I wasn't allowed to have a Nintendo. I guess I had a Game Boy, but I wasn't allowed to have like set-top consoles. Mm-hmm. But I was allowed to have a PC, so I played PC games growing up.
I like that.
And I think it was a cool way to grow up. It's been interesting. So on Kotaku Split Screen, my longest time co-host Jason Schreier, now Jason and Maddie Myers and I will make that show, but he is like totally a console kid growing up, and he's also a little younger than me. So he played like all the JRPGs and like every console game, and I don't have like the same history with those games, but I played everything on PC. And so one of the games was definitely The Secret of Monkey Island. This is like one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time, one of my favorite games of all time. I actually recently did this big multi-instrumental arrangement of the theme from this, which has like long been one of my all-time cheers.
I will put the video link in the show notes, although I'm sure anybody listening to us here has seen it on Kotaku. I think they put it there as well. Yeah.
People seem to dig it. It was so fun to make. This is Mike Land, I believe, is the guy who composed the main theme to Monkey Island, though there were several composers on that soundtrack. I love the soundtrack to that game. That song is it's such a good piece of music. I won't get started. But I remember, so I think I came to that game a little later. That game came out in 90, I think. But I probably played it in like 92. And it was when it was on CD-ROM. I think there were like multiple releases of the game.
Yeah.
And
for sure.
I was like 12 then. And I remember that the game sounded different depending on which computer you played it on, because like your sound card would play the MIDI back differently because it just had different like synthesizers built into it, basically. Like it would be playing different sounds. So if you look on YouTube for the Monkey Island theme, I had to actually look for a while when I was doing the arrangement. Okay, I got to find the one that I know, because the first four that I found sound completely different. Mm-hmm. And I even remember as a kid having that realization. I was pretty young, but I would go to a friend's house to play it on their computer, and the music would sound different, which kind of freaked me out. I was like, why does it sound different? And then kind of figuring out what's a sound card, or what's it called, like PC speaker? You could just have your PCs make the sound itself. And it was like, if you didn't have a sound card and your game sounded terrible, you would have to select PC speaker. And so that was like definitely eye-opening. And then I had it on CD-ROM, Monkey Island, and I could put the CD-ROM into a CD player and it would play the soundtrack like it was a CD, which I remember was this major kind of mind-blowing thing for me. So I would listen to the soundtrack over and over and over again. I probably listened to the soundtrack more than I played the game. Like I played the game once and I listened to the soundtrack, endless times, because it's just so good. There's so much cool stuff going on in it. And I was already, into music and, was hearing things.
Were you a musician at the time?
I was, let me think. Yeah, I was just about to be. So, I mean, I took piano as a kid, but didn't like really stick with it, but was always very musical and like loved to sing, and we played recorder in school and stuff. And then when I was about 12, 13, I started playing saxophone at school. And then got pretty serious about it pretty quickly. And so by the time I was like in high school, I was like, oh, I could be a jazz musician. That's an actual career path. Maybe I'll go do that. And kind of went from there. So it was kind of right before that. And actually, so the other LucasArts game that I put in here is Grim Fandango, which is 1998. And that's kind of a bookend for me for this period of my life, because in 1998 I was 18, I was a senior in high school. I was like, fully, I'm going to be a jazz saxophone player, this is going to be my thing. And then this game comes out, so this is Peter McConnell's like amazing soundtrack for this game, and it's all jazz stuff, really like legit players, really cool creative arrangements, just really amazing music. And in that 8-year period, I had also gotten really serious about music and kind of, started learning jazz in particular. So to have another LucasArts game at that period of time come out with this just totally burning soundtrack, it was sort of like important for me in a similar way. So those were kind of my two big, video games can have really amazing music that goes far beyond Mario or Zelda, which also are awesome, but like it can be this kind of different thing. And I think that was partly from the PC gaming world, right? Like I feel like it was more happening there than the world of console gaming. I want to talk
about that part of it actually, because
nice, yeah.
One of the things that you point out there is that audio cards were different. There hadn't been a unifying standard. Even MIDI was more of a like, how do you communicate between devices?
Right, but not how does it sound.
But not how it sounds at all. And so it was, you get a horn sound or whatever, and it's like, well, who knows what that's going to, it might sound like a car horn on another, right?
You could put a sheet music in front of a terrible musician and they're going to sound bad, or put it in front of an amazing musician.
At least they can do it in the right timing, but who knows what it's going to come out like. There's no intonation. So that's a real problem for preservation, right, as you point out.
It is.
Because who knows I don't know what Mike Land composed it on versus how you heard it.
Right.
And that's a real issue. Like, how did he hear it? So that's a real kind of thing with games going back that far. The other thing, and this I think we might have mentioned talking about Myst and kind of the CD-ROM era, is that the reason why the CD-ROM games would be better is because they were actually just using what's called Redbook audio. Of course, you know what that is, but it's basically the CD standard. So that's why it was literally just because you just had a CD player in your PC, and it was not doing anything special to it. It's like popping in a Blu-ray and playing a video instead of playing a game. It just in your console these days. It's the same sort of thing where it's like, it just has this hardware in it that just does direct decoding of the audio straight into digital output to the speakers. So there's just that kind of like, as it turns out, because we had these CDs in there that were already audio devices, we could just use them as audio devices, and that's how all the audio was put on the drives, or on the discs rather. So a couple things to throw in there for folks.
Well, the other thing that I'd throw in too, based on the two games that you just mentioned, and Brett will probably agree with me because we started very similar times between. I started at LucasArts when Curse of Monkey Island was in development.
Oh, okay, nice.
And
I started right after it came out.
Yeah, and Grim Fandango hadn't started yet, development-wise, but Full Throttle had just shipped. And the thing that I look back all these years later, looking at that era of specifically the audio department at LucasArts at the time, and I'm assuming, though I haven't really done sort of the asking around about this, but I think it was really Lucas, because it was a Lucas company specifically, that audio department in general, just across the board, was stellar, like incredible. The talent that was there. That doesn't
surprise me.
The number of composers, the voice direction talent, the way that they treated audio, it was just on another level from a priority perspective then. And every studio obviously prioritizes it, and I'm definitely not talking that, saying that others are not, putting as much of the passion in there as they did, but for whatever reason, and I didn't know it at the time, right? I was working with these people, and and I took it for granted, because they just were so on their game. And you have those composers like you're talking about, Peter and Clint Bajakin, as well as another name that I throw out there, and just top notch, and for whatever reason, it was, again, maybe the Lucasfilm influence or what have you, but it was an amazing department. So,
and it wasn't a thing that I would have been able to articulate because I was young enough, especially when I was playing those first games. But that was like, there was something special to me about LucasArts games, and I was a very musical kid and was really into music, and that's definitely what it was. It was like you said, it was the audio in general. The audio design on those games is amazing. When I play them now, it's really impressive. I can hear all these creative things going on. But at the time, I think it's like that good test of when you don't have the language for something, you just know that you like it. And that's actually kind of a sign that it's working. I think that was kind of my feeling there. Because, oh man, I mean, so Peter McConnell, can we talk about Peter McConnell for a second?
Absolutely.
Because Brett, I know you've mentioned Psychonauts as well. So he's also the composer of Psychonauts. This guy, like, I've never met him. I lived in San Francisco for a long time. I always wanted to meet him just to get to talk music with him for a second. But I love the way that he writes music. He brings so many cool influences into it. He's such a legit guy. He just doesn't, there's a type of game composer who is just, really good at everything and can just sit there in the studio at the piano and just like make anything for you and is a total professional. I feel like there are like thousands of them now.
He also plays just about every instrument.
Yeah,
like any given soundtrack he's done for a LucasArts game or even subsequently for like Double Fine, he literally can play everything. He might not for the final mix, but he actually comes up with the whole sound. Like for klezmer, he does like a million different instruments to get the klezmer sound. Clarinets obviously, but other stuff too. So.
And I feel like that there's just like there's a sort of this other quality to that kind of a player who just brings in a whole bunch of different influences like that and is willing to just try things out. That in the Double Fine documentary, there's a great scene where he's kind of composing the music for that game, and he's just at his desk and he grabs a violin and like plays a part, and then grabs another instrument and plays a part, and it's just cool to see someone making music like that as opposed to sitting at the super station with the keyboard and the 8 monitors, just able to create anything using samples. Like he really plays the music, and he brought in real musicians for Grimm and for Psychonauts, as far as I know, and just man, he's so good.
Yeah, he's got a sense of play, right? In how he actually composes the music, which I think is some of the joy that you hear in it, right? I mean, I definitely hear, and in Grimm and in Psychonauts in particular, just an artist at play with that music. I mean, is this too big picture to say that this is why video game music is so important? Is it too much of a zoom out tangent to say that like because you play music and you play games and they're both things that are semi improvisational sometimes within a like series of constraints, that this is the thing that video games and music have in common, and the reason that music is so important to a given video game? Well, I think they both absolutely appeal to similar like pre-rational parts of our brain, right? I mean, or maybe on the edge of rationality, right? Just the earliest parts of what make us human, I think, have to do with certain types of art representation and music and rhythm and play, right? I think all of those things kind of develop together, evolutionarily speaking. Like if you look at the, if you talk to, I don't know, paleontologists about dinosaurs, they'll say, oh yeah, raptors could play because we know they could play because modern raptors play.
Right, they would play with their prey as they cut them open with their huge claws. Yeah, I wrote this thing for Kotaku when I was kind of early on, and I still think it's one of the best things I ever wrote. So I like peaked early, and then it was all downhill from there. And it was about how music and lyrics are exactly like story and gameplay. I remember. And it was this theory I came up with, and I was like, I almost didn't need to write the article because it's like, oh yeah, that's it right there. It's the headline and you're done. Because I feel like people talk about this all the time, like, oh well, video game stories like don't really work, or they'll critique a movie and be like, it's kind of just like a video game. They're just trying to get you from place to place so you can see cool set pieces, but the story doesn't matter. And it strikes me as very similar, where if the music is really bumping and the beat is really good and it sounds amazing, you can have terrible lyrics or unintelligible lyrics and no one really cares. It's just, or it doesn't hurt the music in the same way that you can have a great game that's just really fun to play and like maybe there's a narrative on top of it, or maybe there isn't and nobody cares. That always struck me as an interesting like an interesting expression, I guess, of the parallel that we're talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I actually think it can go the other way too. I mean, honestly,
absolutely,
I think there are games that have just great stories that the gameplay's not all that, but the story really sticks out to you. And I don't want to pick on anybody about that, but I think it can go the same way. I mean, I think lyrically, you could have a song that you're just like, oh wow, I just love. I mean, usually there's some melody to that as well, so it's not a direct analog, but it's like, well, I really connect with the lyrics. You see a lot of that, especially in moody teen music or whatever. It's like, oh, I really connect with the, nobody's connecting with Metallica's moody teen music, but people will connect with, something else that really speaks.
And it's a spectrum, I guess. And then like the moments of magic, at least this is for narrative video games or songs with lyrics, is like when they really work together. When you actually get a place where the lyrics crescendo at the same time as the music, and they reach this incredible moment together while someone's crying out some meaningful word and the band is going really loud. Same as in games when you have an incredible moment of interactivity that also is like working perfectly with the story. Like definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other talking about some of my work with composers. The interesting thing that's happened over time, and I don't know if you've been experiencing this yet or not with the stuff you've been doing, Kirk, but composers have needed to become a lot more sort of technical and game design oriented over time for a lot of the stuff we were talking about with iMUSE. Because I think LucasArts was trailblazing quite a bit with interactive, dynamic music at the time. But it's been something that I think the industry has been grappling with for a long time about the right ways to do that. And every engine does it differently, and people try different things and they bolt different things on. But some of the best composers I've worked with are thinking like game designers, thinking like gameplay people. And going back to sort of the conversations I have with composers, it is often like we're pitching to each other ways to make the music dynamic for the game that we're making. So like you said, when those highs are happening, ideally based on player agency, then the music is supporting that, right? Or really like lifting it up and making it, perfect, or really coming together. And it's very difficult to do. And some composers are very linear, right? And they're great, but they think in that way. And especially ones that are coming from other mediums who struggle with video games. But the ones that have kind of probably gone through that process and realized that they love working on video games and realize that there's another sort of layer or another lens, if you will, that they have to think about it through. And that's sort of almost like the technical musician side of them, where they actually, one of the composers I worked on with Halo, like, he was actually coming up with how technically the system was going to work for this sort of world structure that we have, a whole different thing that you wouldn't think a composer would, but he liked doing it. It was actually something he was excited about.
Yeah, I think about, so I have never written music for a video game, and I think it's just a skill set that I don't have, like, especially because what you're talking about is, I think, truer and truer. You need to really know your stuff about the technical side of things and, like, how to actually implement it in the game and be able to do so much more than just, write a good motif and, like, a good theme for your hero. Like, that's the baseline that you need to be able to do. But I think about, this is sort of a musical parallel, I guess, and that's that when I'm writing music now, when I'm composing it or, writing, I'm usually writing in a digital, workstation, a digital audio workstation. I usually use Logic, whatever, like Pro Tools, that kind of software. And that's not something that people were able to do, 20, 30 years ago. You'd get your four-track tape recorder and you'd record a song, you'd kind of record the bass line and sing it, but that's kind of all you had. Now you have a creative suite that can let you could create an entire album just by yourself. And so the composition process kind of changes because suddenly you're writing for the studio. You're like, well, let's pan this thing left and pan that right. Like, arranging music stops just being about who's playing which notes, which parts are taking over the melody, which parts are complementing it. We're writing this out on a score, and it becomes also we're mixing this in real time in a recording session as we write it. So it's the same kind of idea. It's like adding yet another discipline to what was initially kind of, its own discipline. It's now become a more maximalist thing. And I can imagine that you're doing that. You're also doing a mix, and you're mixing it in with game audio, and you're implementing it into an interactive experience. Like, it's a whole huge series of skills that you need to have. It's very impressive.
Yeah, you're talking and it's making me think of, I think it was David Byrne wrote this book, How Music Works. I'm sure you've read this. Yeah. And it's very much that sort of thing. It's like, well, what is the environment you're actually writing for and how that changes the music that comes out? And, I mentioned Jesse, and the sort of short stingers and scheduling those. And with iMUSE, it was more about, it's all about the crossfade and just timing those to be good was really the biggest thing, is like that the crossfades wouldn't be jarring. Right. Because they didn't have lots of streams of music to play with, right?
It was like a nightmare, right? Like on Curse of Monkey Island. I feel like I've heard that it was a huge nightmare getting that to work.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they really just the audio formats didn't often support information in them either to be able to tell you, like, hey, if this is a good time to match up with this other thing, and like to know to pre-stream in. Pre-streaming means just like warming up the memory with enough data to get started, basically, as you start streaming, so that you can play it exactly when you want to. And there's also just like varying frame rates. Like there's a ton of technical issues to make it sound right. Because you can basically only send information like at an appropriate time in your frame and say, okay, start now. So like syncing that up, because the audio, I mean, one of the things with our ears is that we'll hear the distortion of two things that aren't in sync that should be really, really easily. It's like an uncanny valley for music. And getting that exactly right is a super hard thing to do, especially, if you don't have a lot of control over your frame rate. So yeah, tons of challenges in those old machines.
Only imagine. I feel like a guy, Austin Wintory, the composer of Journey and a bunch of other stuff, great composer. I feel like I talked to him about working on Journey, and he definitely was one of those composers who came in with a really open-minded kind of ground level approach. And I think he worked with that game company. He was like in there, like working with them from the beginning. And really, like, how can we build the music around this game? How can we build the game around the music? I feel like that's a good example of, Tim, what you were talking about a little while ago, of just like that game is almost this pure expression of music, and it's interactive as well. But the score is such a fundamental part of that. And I feel like he's talked at length about that process of like really coming in. And it wasn't just, I'm going to write you a couple themes and you can make it work. It was like, we're going to build this whole thing around the music I'm composing. Yeah. So that does seem like a good way to do things. If you can.
That is a good, that's a great example. I remember loving the way that worked. And I feel like Flower, they did some similar stuff with that.
Yeah, there's definitely some cool music going on in Flower too. It's like a little proto Journey. Like it's cool, but it's not quite on the level of sophistication, I would say. Journey, but I like that game in a lot of ways, I guess.
Fully realized, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, like, obviously there are a fair number of composers that are coming from film or TV or other disciplines, right, who are used to a certain way. And just the musical composition world, that world, especially, Hollywood and stuff, is just a different beast, so there's some transitions that's happened there. But I think the ones that I've enjoyed working with, and partially because of the kinds of games that I like working on, we spend a lot of time, as Brett can attest to, building a gameplay system that is dynamic, right? Whether that be a combat system or physics or what have you, right? And we get into the weeds on all the nuances and the bells and whistles and the different knobs for tuning and levers and et cetera. Why can't that be music as well?
Right.
And have it just as dynamic. And I think the composers that have that click in their head, I think for those kinds of games, at least, right? There definitely are the Uncharted or what have you that that maybe are better for linear music, but anyway, those are the ones that I enjoy.
I think a lot about Zelda. I think Zelda is kind of an interesting one for a number of reasons in this kind of on this tangent. So like I did, like I said, I didn't have consoles playing growing up. But I did play Link to the Past at a friend's house. I remember loving the Zelda theme, like Koji Kondo's original Zelda theme, which is a great heroic melody. But I feel like the ways that Zelda has changed over time kind of says a lot about, or the way Zelda music specifically has changed over time, kind of says a lot about how game music has changed. Two things that I'm thinking of here. One is the Breath of the Wild music. I believe Manaka Kataoka, she was the primary composer, but I think there were a lot of composers on that. But that soundtrack to that game, because I know you guys played this. I went through all the games that you talked about, and I was like, okay, what are some of the soundtracks we can talk about
200
for these
hours
games
for me of that game.
So I've played a crazy amount of that game. That's like one of my favorite games I've ever played. And the music, the way that game uses music is so organic and so different from the way that, say, Link to the Past uses Zelda music.
Yep.
Like, that theme does turn up, but it couldn't be more different. But it's also so informed by, like, what kind of a game it is. Like, it's clear that was composed by people who were very, very aware of the creative vision of the game and like were building something that would fit with it. I mean, it's just the completely different thing, despite the fact that at one point you're riding a horse and a cello kind of sneaks in for a second and plays that original Zelda theme. And the other thing that I think is pretty cool was, I'm forgetting the name of the game. The one that came out last year, the indie rhythm game, the Crypt of the Necrodancer people made it.
Right. The Legend of Hyrule.
Yes, Cadence of Hyrule, thank you.
Right.
So Danny Baranowski, amazing composer, like Super Meat Boy, super cool composer, great musician. He wrote the music to that, and that was cool too, because that was basically hearing someone who isn't, a Nintendo house composer who like is, really involved, who has done completely different kinds of games, giving his own riff on the Zelda theme in an official Zelda game, which I also think is really cool. Like, I like that Nintendo is kind of opening up those themes and kind of, allowing other people to take a crack at it. So yeah. I like where Zelda is going, is basically what I'm going.
Totally.
Yeah, no argument with that. I mean, one of the things is that you think of Japanese game development culture as being a lot more structured in a lot of ways, and a lot more, even more hierarchical. I don't know. You just get this sense of sort of Japanese culture and like office. People who go to work for the same company for a million years and they kind of fit into their into their place in the hierarchy, and that's just what they do, forever. Mm-hmm. And Nintendo actually puts a kind of lie to that, in that you can feel them sort of developing their people, over numerous games. We talk a lot about them shipping their prototypes. Like they put a prototype in one game, and then it's the next game, right? It's the whole basis of the next thing that they do. See that a lot in the Mario games, but I'm also seeing that, or hearing that, I should say, in the music as well. So that's a good call out with Breath of the Wild. It definitely happens with Mario as well, where they do tons of playing with that, but it's more typically just, let me take it and put it in a different setting. Like, let me take it and make it, I don't know, island music for Sunshine or something like that.
Right. Mario music is on its own whole frequency. I love Mario music. Zelda, they're so different. I feel like I'm more of an affinity, I guess, for Zelda games, so I think more about the Zelda music. But man, like playing Mario Odyssey, the music in that game, just give me a break.
I know. Yeah,
Nintendo composers kind of freak me out. There's so much talent there. It's pretty wild.
That's really great. Well, let's go to some more of these PC. Well, you've picked out lots I see now. Like, we played all of these.
Yeah. That was on purpose.
Very good. You also had XCOM in there. Intro theme music.
Yeah. So it's funny because I wanted to go back to it. I went back to that and Tomb Raider because I know you guys talked about both of those games, and those were both games that I played when I was pretty young on my PC in the 90s. And what was Tomb Raider? Was that like 96 or 95, something like that? 96. So both of them, XCOM was older, I think, or UFO Enemy Unknown, whatever it was called when I bought it. So the only reason I wanted to mention this is because I loved that opening cinematic. Do you remember this? It's like the aliens land. Oh, okay. You talked about it on the show. Okay. Because it's such a lie. It's such an amazing lie. Because I remember watching it as a kid and being like, oh, hell yeah, I just got this game. This is going to be sweet. I'm going to go take my chain gun and wreck some aliens. And that music, it's like very strange music. I went and rewatched it recently. It's this is composed by John Broomhall as the composer on that game. And I just think that it's, speaking of how music has like changed over the years, I think that it's interesting how the modern XCOM games, while they still do let you die and fail horribly, they definitely actually more capture that exciting, heroic energy. And especially XCOM 2, that was Timothy Michael Wynn, the composer on that, who's great. I really like the music to that. It just sounds like Avengers music or something. It's more like super heroic, the actual music in the game. And the actual music in the game XCOM often kind of just sounds like horror death music, because that's kind of what it is, because you're just gonna get killed. So I don't know, I mostly threw that in there because I saw you had played it, and I have these funny memories of wanting that game to be what it promised. And then I was kind of too young to understand this ultra crunchy, hardcore tactics game that it actually was.
Well, I re-listened to it for this episode too, because we played it so long ago, and to echo that and to add to it a little bit, I think I remember when the game came out and having friends play, because I also bounced off of it. We talked about this on the series that we did on it. I bounced off of it initially, so I never really played much of it back in the day. So it was really great to kind of dig really deeply into it for the podcast. But I remember talking to people who did get into it, and the way that they would, because that was a game where you would tell stories about what happened to you, because so many crazy sort of, systemic sort of things could happen based on what your choices were in a given battle. Like a firefight can be even though it's super low res and it's turn based and it has all of, like you said, crunchy is a good word for it, all these crunchy things that people bounce off of. The people that really grabbed onto it had stories that they would tell you water cooler style that opening music would be totally appropriate backing.
That's a really good point. That's very true.
They were talking about it. It's the way that they would talk about it. And so they would always get me into it. I probably restarted that game like 10 times back in the day because, Morgan Gray, a friend of mine who was a tester at the time at LucasArts, was like, yeah, you have to play that game because this and this and this. And he would make it sound so amazing, like an Avengers, a theme. And then I re-listened to that opening theme again, and it really gets you into that comic. It's very genre based. It's comic booky, very pulpy, and it's that high action, very 90s, early 90s or what have you. And it fits, but it's like the stories that people tell versus, like you said, you don't experience that when you're playing. You're like, oh, I forgot to turn my line of sight thing on, and blah blah blah. And So
but you also sort of do experience it, because there's a way in which I think that stuff just kind of cuts through to, I don't know, whatever, our limbic system or something, and we go and we're like, I'm not seeing the terrible visual effect for the explosion and like going I'm going, oh man, now I can't go through that area, and like because of the gameplay implications of all the things that happen in that game, I'm actually deeper in, and like that's why those stories are compelling. Right, exactly. There's more there in my brain than actually appears on the screen. Like, oh man, now I can't go through the gas station. It's not a gas station. It's two tiles that happen to have gas tanks on them. It's not like there's no connection. I've made connections that and I think that reflects the way the music backs up that story, I guess. Saying, right?
I wonder if it's
why opening music like that is important, because it sets the stage.
Right, it sets the tone. I wonder if the reason that, if it's mostly just that because I was too young kind of to get into that game, it was just too complicated for me, that I bounced off of it, because I did play the heck out of both of the new ones, and they're great, and I have those same stories of, like, oh man, it hit the fan, and then like my sniper had to step up and everyone was dead, and then we got out of it and it was amazing, and you tell those stories and the music does feel appropriate to it. So that's very true, actually. I wonder if it's just that the music feels like a lie because it was a lie for me, but I was the problem if I had played it a bunch.
The original is very,
certainly tough. A tougher game to get into than the newer ones. They did sand off a lot of edges. So you guys talked about Tomb Raider, and we talked about the new Tomb Raider a little, but man, I do want to mention, I have a very vivid memory of this. So I guess when I was like 16, I loved the Tomb Raider menu music in the original Tomb Raider.
Too.
I loved that game, and it's so funny because I remember the whole Lara Croft, whatever, the first like cover girl of video games and stuff, like all of that really like sexist coverage of her. And that it wasn't that at all. It was totally just, this is an interactive Indiana Jones kind of thing. Like, that was what was exciting. And that's what that music promised, I think. Like that, it's just like, like 3 notes or whatever. And it just, you can find on YouTube, there's like 10 hours of the YouTube menu music. I'm definitely not the only person who like has a soft spot for that menu music, but it's so good. And again, it's the kind of thing where the console music of the time, it was sophisticated in a different way, but when you listen to just the way that it was recorded, they're using like sampled strings and like really beautiful like reverb on everything, and it just has this really nice open sound to it that just wasn't the kind of thing that I was hearing when I would go play console games at my friend's house. I was like, oh, this is the real stuff though, guys. Like, this is where it sounds good.
Yeah. Right, yeah, it's this lonely music too that also sets up when we played it. I remember it being like, oh, it's lonelier feeling than I remember. I mean, there's only
not a lot of music in the game, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Almost none while you're playing.
That's what I thought.
It's all ambience.
It's just like echoes of her footsteps and stuff. That's kind of my memory of it.
We talked a lot about it, and definitely the sort of Tomb Raider versus Indiana Jones, sort of contrast and debate is definitely something that we would talk a lot about at Crystal, and the differences, of course. And then I think that music, that menu music, is like the ultimate example of that for me, because for the series, for the podcast, we talked a lot about its exploration pillar, and its sense of you really going. Like in Indiana Jones, obviously, A, because it's a film, but also B, it's a pulp genre film. And so it's a lot of small scenes with, there's definitely good pacing, but there's small scenes with, punctuations of different purposes for those scenes. And with Tomb Raider, you're playing for multiple hours, just roaming around and exploring, right? You're doing like the work of an archaeologist.
Right, the stuff that they don't show Indiana Jones doing.
They don't show, right? But that's why that music is so perfect for it, because it just sets the stage for this like ambient experience where you're going to be running through these deep caverns, and it is, like Brett said, it's alone. You're alone. It's somber, and there are some high action moments, but they're usually like in the CG cinematics, right? They're not even in the main game. Right. Even combat in the game doesn't take that long usually, and then you're back to just running around. And that music, that little trill that they have in that menu music has stuck with me. So that's why I wanted to work at Crystal, to be honest.
Wow, yeah, it's a great theme. That's very true. That I feel like if you just listen to the Raiders theme, like it's like John Williams' greatest theme, maybe his heroic theme for Indiana Jones. But compared to the Tomb Raider theme, it kind of tells you everything about the difference between those two games, at least those initial two.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I want to get to you endorsing your stuff, and I don't know. Do you want to tackle one more game?
I don't know. Sure. I feel like we could go forever. I could talk for a million years about this stuff.
Well, the other one that I thought is probably worth talking about is GTA and licensed music. Because it's not a thing that we've talked about at all. I mean, other than sort of the adaptation of movie music, for the things that we've worked on. But yeah, GTA. I mean, that's one that I definitely. It's not something actually I don't think we talked about very much, but I can definitely remember. Whichever one it was that had the Welcome to the Jungle and their, and when they had their release video.
Vice City had the best soundtrack, I think.
Oh yeah,
I'd have to go through and listen to them all. They're all good, man. Yeah. So this was mainly, I saw you guys had talked about GTA, and that to me is the defining aspect of those games. Yeah. And I think the most interesting thing about them is that so many times when I talk about video game music, when people talk about video game music, they're talking about what we've all been talking about. Composers writing music that underscores the game and gives it its emotion and stuff. But what GTA does and what Rockstar does so well, I mean, Rockstar does a lot of things well.
Yeah, they have a lot of money to do a lot of things well.
Yeah, and they take music and audio so seriously there. It's freaky. I mean, you talked about that Red Dead Redemption thing I wrote for Gamer Melodico. By the way, it's so cool that you read my little gaming blog that I wrote before anyone knew who the hell I was, and I hadn't worked at Kotaku or anything.
I read all that stuff, man.
That soundscape of that game is so freaking good and so different from Grand Theft Auto that it's impressive. I know it's different studios made that than made whatever Vice City or GTA, but it is impressive that a similar creative vision would give such starkly different soundscapes and both so good. But yeah, the licensed music thing. I mean, I feel like a lot of people discover music through Grand Theft Auto. Didn't Grand Theft Auto 5 just get a patch like a month ago to add a new radio station? I'm pretty sure that happened.
I think they did, yeah.
It's like they're adding new music to the game. Because if you play the game, a lot of the identity of the game is, especially I think of Grand Theft Auto 5 this way, is like driving over the Hollywood Hills with some super cool song on. And usually it's a song, at least in GTA 4 and 5, that I'd never heard before. Like that isn't on the radio all the time. Like it's a pop song or a dance number or some EDM thing or something, like just something I've never heard of, but that's perfect for the moment, you know, that captures the moment. And that's something that so few games do well, that it's like an underappreciated art form, I think, is like picking licensed music and creating radio stations and playlists for an open world game. Like I've played so many games, especially Ubisoft games. I'm thinking like the first Watch Dogs. I don't want to like put anybody on blast. I know, I guess a lot of game developers listen to this, but like there are totally games that try to do this. They'll have a radio and music comes on. I remember in the first Watch Dogs, it was like all Chicago bands, and it's good music. I mean, it's like some great bands, but it doesn't make sense. And when you play the game, it's just kind of on, and you're like, why is this song playing? And then why was that song playing? And there's not that much of it because Rockstar has so much money. They license a ton of music. They get, whatever. They've got like DJs coming in and making unique tracks and mixes for their games and stuff. But it just goes to show, I guess, how hard that is. And I don't fully understand the like alchemy of doing it, but it's so cool that, I mean, they started it forever ago with the first Grand Theft Auto, and they've been with GTA 3, I guess. They've been just perfecting it over time, and it's something that nobody else has really quite cracked. Like, there are other open world games that have good music. They're out there. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I know there are some. But it's such a cool thing and such a different kind of approach to video game music.
I think it may be because they're so influenced by film, and films that use licensed music rather than composing. I mean, they often do both in films that use licensed music, but just having that perfect bit of music.
Sure, like the Scorsese needle drop,
Yeah, exactly. Just the exact perfect thing to have at this moment, and they've got it, right? And Scorsese's a great example. Of somebody who just finds sort of period stuff that exactly fits the emotion of the time, right? Because music reflects and influences the feeling of the time, right? I mean, the 80s definitely feels like a thing. You mentioned Vice City.
Yeah, why Vice City's soundtrack works so well, exactly.
Exactly, right. So you play that, and it reinforces sort of the music was written to fit the time and was influencing the time. I mean, it's all just one huge bag, ball of wax or whatever that get all mixed together. Yeah, I agree. Vice City is kind of the best one for a soundtrack. I was thinking of, I think it was GTA 4 was such a huge deal when they were dropping, because the soundtracks had become such a thing, that when they were announcing it, that you were hearing some of the music that was going to be in the game, and they were like, oh my God, they got this and that and the other thing.
They've got, Vice City definitely, for the reason you say, I think is the most iconic one. It just has like Flock of Seagulls. It has so many killer 80s tunes, and it's like that place in time. I really like the tracks from GTA 4. Like, I think those radio stations are super cool. There's like that Slavic radio station that has a couple of those jams that are like in the trailers, that like kind of Eastern European hip hop stuff that's really good. And there's a jazz station in 4. I don't know if there is in 5, but in 4 I remember Move from Birth of the Cool, that Miles Davis record, comes on. Nice. And it's like, just sometimes you'll be driving around in that game and then Birth of the Cool comes on this radio station. I was like, dude, this game is amazing. Like, what other game could I possibly be playing where that happens? Also, side note, in GTA 4, the saxophone player, GTA 4, he is holding a tenor, but he's playing what sounds like an alto. But he's pretty good. He plays like St. Thomas, the Sonny Rollins tune. He like quotes St. Thomas. I just sat there for a while listening to him. I was like, let's see if this guy can play. And I was like, oh shit, he's like playing jazz tunes. Like, nice. It's pretty good.
How does he stack up against the guy in the Lost Boys? That's the baseline for me.
Well, he's wearing a shirt, so he's already at a disadvantage.
That's my sax image going back to my own childhood.
Oh yeah, same.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I always play sax. That's like how you have to play saxophone. You can't play sax with a shirt on. They're like,
no.
What are you talking about?
This is probably TMI, but I lived on Cape Cod, and I had a gabled window, so I could get out onto the roof from my bedroom, and I would just go out and play saxophone on the roof.
I like where this is going.
Come on, that is right?
No, I would. I'd just like pop out the window and go up on the roof, and my parents.
Beautiful. Oh man, beautiful. If anybody has pictures of that,
no, there are no pictures.
Send them in, please. Email them in. We need to see them.
Take a picture for me, please.
Oh boy. Anyway, well, thanks so much for talking about all those things. We wanted to make sure we gave you some time to talk about. We talked about it a little bit up top, but I can't say enough good things about the podcast you're on.
Oh man,
they are great. I've listened to all of both of them, so.
That means a lot. It's really cool that you listen. I'm glad you like them both.
Yeah,
and I think if people like music, they should listen to Strong Songs. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know Kotaku Split Screen. That's a video game podcast. But Strong Songs, man, I guess I'm promoting that because that's like my project only, and I'm really proud of it. It's been going great. It's been really fun to get back to music, and I feel like, I don't know, it's a project I want to do kind of forever. It feels like it brings together a lot of things that I like doing, and I like people write in and say they're learning music because they listen to the show. Like it's felt like a really wonderful, positive thing to be a part of. So I hope people check it out.
Yeah, it is. It's relentlessly positive, which is one of the things I love about it. I mean, your enthusiasm, just I just hear it
music,
coming
man.
through, right? I mean, it helps that I know you. I can like picture you talking and like laughing. When you laugh, I'm like, I see you laughing, right? And so it helps me. But yeah, I mean, it's just I can't underscore enough how it like helps me understand what I'm hearing, and why things kind of like hit you a little off, and you're like, what's going on with that? And, and all that stuff. And yeah, it's fantastic. I think you've done 21 songs now, so
yeah, it'll be probably 22 when people hear this. It's going to be
right.
There's a new episode going up the day after we're recording this.
Oh yeah, well, so if they're fans of both, we'll see which one they go to first. We also come out on Wednesday, so
that's true. Wednesday podcast. I feel like Wednesday it's a good podcast day.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for bringing some thump and sizzle and pop to us.
Listen to you.
Oh yeah, I'm there, man. We appreciate it so much, Kirk, and we loved the new theme music, of course, and we've loved having your thoughts both on how that was made, but the game music that's meant something to you.
Yeah, it's been great, and like you said, we could keep going. We didn't even hit, I think, your full list, and it's we don't. Brett, have we had? We always talk about getting more composers on anyway.
Yeah, we haven't. Because people often ask, like, could you talk more about the music?
Yeah,
and it's just not a thing that we're super equipped to. So this was the one.
This is it. Yeah, well, it was totally my pleasure. And yeah, I'm glad you guys like the music. And this was really fun. Like, yeah, I could talk about video game music forever, for hours and hours. So anytime you want to do it again, I am totally down.
Okay. Cool. Well, new recurring guest. Thanks so much, Kirk.
Cheers, guys.
Welcome back from our break and our conversation with Kirk. That was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I love talking to Kirk about anything, really, but when talking to him or listening to him talk about music is just the best thing. Yeah, but it was fun too to hear how you guys work together.
Yeah, it was definitely light, and simple, and he did his magic, back, and we just kind of passed it back and forth and stuff. But I think he got it pretty quickly. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't take a lot of sort of back and forth in that from like what the vision was perspective. I think he kind of got it. So it was fun, and he's just so passionate and just positive about life. So
yes, yeah.
So it's infectious.
Yeah, he really is. He's very energetic, and he brings just so much to everything he does. And like, I mean, I said it while we were talking to him, but I'll say it again. Like, I love strong songs. I mean, I'm another person who supports a ton of things on Patreon or whatever. And I guess I should say, I support Kirk's podcast on Patreon. For full disclosure, I guess I'm not a journalist. I don't owe you that, but now you know. I pay some money Kirk's way every month because it's great and I want to support it, and I think it's just fantastic. I spent some time with him when I was there in August. I went down to Portland one weekend and spent quite a lot of time with Kirk, actually, pretty much a day and a night over at Kirk's place, and went to see a comedy show together. I mean, it was just a blast spending that kind of time with him because I don't get those opportunities. And he's just so great to spend time with. Real good time. Recommend his podcast. I recommend Split Screen as well. We've talked about that before on the show, but the energy he brings to talking about music is fantastic. And I'm so glad that he's made that the center of his life again. It's really fun to see a friend go back and do something that they love so much, right? I mean, it's great. So anyway, thanks again to Kirk for the music and for coming on and talking to us both about that and music and games generally, and then a few that we've talked about as well. So he had some great insights there too. So much good stuff. Okay, well, before we turn to talking about what's next, I do want to hit a bit of feedback that came in towards the end of December from Philip. He says, new listener here, love the show. This was sent to devgameclub@gmail.com. He says, hi, Tim and Brett. I'm Philip from Copenhagen, and I've just started listening to the podcast about a week or two ago. I'm eagerly munching through the backlog. First jumped on some series about games I've got a personal connection to, Pokemon, World of Warcraft, and Kingdom Hearts. It was great hearing your first impressions and struggles with the games, as well as your game design input. After I finished with those, I started listening to the series from newest to oldest, Shenmue and Eternal Darkness, which brings with it the new enjoyment of learning about games that had passed me by. There's one thing I feel like is missing, and that is a short introduction of some of the basic mechanics and style of the game in question, and maybe some introduction to whatever story beats you hit during the last week of play. I totally get that you have limited time and there's so much other interesting stuff to discuss, but I think spending 5 minutes explaining the very basics of what happened at the beginning of the episode before jumping into the depth of things could help listeners who haven't played the game follow along. One huge example is Eternal Darkness. I finished the entire series of podcasts, and I have no sense of how the melee combat works. I get that the combat might not be that interesting, but spending 10 seconds explaining that it's just a single attack and block or whatever, again, he doesn't know, would help a bit with visualizing what you guys are talking about. You often get excitedly talking about your shared experience, which is a big part of why the show is fun to listen to. But sometimes when you jump in too quickly, listeners who aren't familiar with the game might get a bit lost. It's, of course, a balance. You guys are by no means expected to talk us through frame by frame. That said, even those series were a blast. Just wanted to mention it. Best regards, Philip. Thanks for the feedback, Philip. We have a hard time with that. I feel like we often talk about pre-show how we should talk about what happened this week or whatever, and we either leave it for last or it just gets pushed off entirely, and maybe we should kind of use it as some way of we do. Well, we start off with the intro and away we go to whatever random thing that's about, and we're already off. We have plans when we come into the podcast, and they are immediately dashed against the rocks of speaking live to one another is what happens.
Well, the other thing that I constantly have to remind myself of, because I think our original vision for starting the podcast, and we've talked about that from time to time, we had this sort of book club style that was inspired by another podcast, Rebel FM. They don't even do it anymore. And I think in my head, sometimes or even subconsciously, I'm thinking that more people are playing along with us than actually are. And over the almost 4 years of the podcast, I think we've actually morphed more into just us analyzing games than really a book club style,
Right.
Because, we know that some people do play along with us kind of at the cadence, but I think it's just kind of taken on a life of its own. It's not really that. So I think in my head, I'm thinking often they've played what we've played, and I shouldn't do that. I think I missed that window now because I've trained myself to think that way. So I need to retrain myself, I think, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, speaking as the person who tends to do more of the organizing and production stuff, I do take notes on what we're going to talk about. And I'm probably the most guilty of ignoring that. I mean, I literally it's right there in front of me. And instead I'm like, yeah, we're just in conversation because we've known each other a long time also. So it's just, I'm just happy to be talking to Tim about games each week. And so I just kind of lose track that there's an audience out there when we're actually talking. So that's part of it for me too, is that I would do this if nobody was listening, because I in fact, nobody listens, Tim. I just tell you it's a couple thousand people. It's been a flat zero for you. No,
we've never released an episode.
We've had the episodes actually don't even come. You wouldn't even know.
I'm the only one with access to the website, and I go there and it's like, yeah, the episode's up there.
Yep, it's there. We must be getting people.
That would be the grand practical joke of all time if you did that. That would be amazing. Yeah. Well, I mean, I have copious notes for every episode, but I don't always follow them, but B, because I think we like the organic nature of the conversation too, but also B, none of my notes usually, to his I think excellent point, none of my notes are reminding me to explain the details of things if you hadn't played. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I think it's just it's almost like usability in games, right? Just you have to remind yourself the players are coming in fresh and they don't know how to play your game. So we need to remind ourselves that people are coming in, they're just listening, and they're, most people, probably majority of people, are not playing with us. So
right.
And I think it's good feedback.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it is for sure. I mean, all feedback's great to hear, but also I do think that we tend to get a lot of email from people who are familiar with the game that they're writing about, right? It's a game that they particularly connected with, either because they've played it before or whatever. So that I think also reinforces our view of oh yeah, this, people are playing along or know the games anyway.
Yeah, we don't hear from the Phillips.
We don't hear from the Phillips as much. So that makes it extra good to be hearing from the Phillips. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Philip, for that from Denmark. I don't know if that's it might be the first time from Denmark. I don't remember another Denmark email. So thank you very much. Let's turn now and talk about our next game, which we kind of on the fly figured out today. Speaking of production,
it's something we talk about all the time.
We have talked about it a million times. You want to intro the game a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain genres that Brett and I definitely gravitate toward, and there's some that we've neglected for sure, and we've talked about that from time to time, and some that we may never get to be honest, but we'll see.
And that's why we're playing DDR. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. But one genre in particular we knew we would eventually get to is the sort of simulation, sort of raw, true simulation game, a la Civilization, or SimCity's sort of similar but a different kind of sim. But so we're going to be playing Civilization 3 specifically because it's more accessible than 2, though 2 was probably a sea change for the series. 3 definitely was a big one as well. So we're finally going to play a sim, sort of the pure sense of that word, at least in the game space. When we say sim. World builder, sim, world simulation,
and turn-based strategy.
Strategy. And so in Civ's case, you're obviously simulating Civilization and all of the eras that come with it. So we're going to play Civ 3. Finally jump in, as Brett mentioned, in between on break. This would be our first Sid Meier game as well, which is another luminary from the industry. So
absolutely, yeah. Sid's been doing it quite a while. He's like a 30-year plus, I think, making games, right? He must go back into the 80s.
Yeah.
So he's been around a long time and is really important to the industry. And it's I keep thinking about sort of designers that we haven't played their games yet, and I'm always like, oh man, we have to get to this person or that person. Or this series or this genre or whatever. And this is one of those that for one thing, confession for me, this is not a game that I have played. I've started a lot of games of Civ and Civ 3 in particular, I think. But it's not a game that I've ever completed a game of. Although I did play a full game of Alpha Centauri, which was another Sid Meier game sort of in the Civ mold, just set off planet. So I don't know if we'll encounter why that is. I don't really remember. It's been since Civilization 3 since I've tried to play one. So I'll have to dig into that a little bit. Yeah, but it'll be interesting. We're gonna try to do just a few hours of play. I don't know how many turns that works out to, but we'll try to do a few turns and then just one more turn. Right, is how it goes. Right, over the next week for the first episode, when of course we'll set the game in its context. We'll probably talk about Civilization as a series as well, instead of just this particular installment, and probably a little bit about Sid Meier as well. So you can look forward to that next week. Yeah, and then we have another one after that. One thing we didn't talk about pre-show, and I've seen you now announce it online and Twitter and stuff. So before we go to that, do you want to talk about what's happening with you this year?
Oh, right. Yeah, we didn't prep for that. Yeah. I have.
If you don't want to, I can cut this out, and we don't have to talk.
No,
about it
no. I'm totally fine. Yeah, it doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I'm going to be. We're going to take a podcast break. That's what I would encourage Brett to temporarily have someone take over for me while I'm gone. But I'm going to be gone for 5 months, doing the Pacific Crest Trail, which is for those who don't know, it is a backpacking trail that goes from Mexico over the border of Mexico to Canada, all across essentially the mountain ranges of the West Coast. It takes about 5 months. I may finish a little earlier, but that's sort of the outside case. And I will be out in the wilderness for that time, from town to town, but wouldn't be possible to continue the podcast. And Brett has graciously, and my wife, is allowing me to do this. But it's been for me, it's been a 30-year in the making. I've wanted to do this for 30 years, and there really has not been a good time for me to do it until this year. So this is my window. So not great timing, but that's been the story all this time. There's never been a good time, so I just got to do it.
There's never an easy time to take off. I mean, for me to leave here for a month was like, oh wow, that's a lot to consider. It's hard to even imagine with 5.
Yeah, so it's a big thing for everyone in my life to disappear. So but yeah, so what we decided to do was essentially pause the podcast. So I apologize ahead of time for that. Definitely. Podcasts do have breaks sometimes, extended breaks, but I think what we decided to do is just basically go silent for that time, and then we'll kick it back off. It's not the end of the podcast for sure. I'll be back, and I'll be excited to kick it back off. But we have Civilization, and then we probably have another game after that we've already planned, and we'll announce that later. But then after that game, we'll take a break.
Yeah, and I think I may, I haven't decided what kind of schedule this would be on, but just in order to not make it go dead entirely over that period, I think I might aim to do something like a short, maybe 15 minutes every couple of weeks, me just talking about what I've been playing. It wouldn't be the deep talks that we have, but more just like, hey, I appreciate this about this game that I've been playing.
Oh yeah,
sort of stuff. Idea. So I may just to make sure the feed's still active and people still hear it, and have an opportunity for people to send in feedback or whatever. Would be something to keep, just to kind of keep it alive and remember, remind people that we're still here. So
yeah. That's perfect.
And if I have the time, I can just take all this audio I have from you from 4 years of doing this, and I can literally make you say anything I want. I'll program a synthesizer. It just takes all your voice, and
that would be. I would love to hear that.
A Tim Longo soundboard over here.
That's great.
Whenever I say something, really funny, you'll just go, "Ah, geez," and I'll have it all That'll work out.
Well, if you do those short episodes to keep sort of the feed alive, it's not out of the realm of possibility that when I'm in a town, I could guest in and do it, do a hello at least on my phone or something,
Okay, yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
I want to know you're still alive. Yeah.
That's the big deal. And I, in future episodes of the podcast, I'm kind of doing a little bit of a couple extra things attached to this trip that I'll talk about in a future episode, because I do want to announce some of that stuff, some charity work, and I might actually even develop a small sort of autobiographical game about the experience. I want to, rather than, a lot of people do movies or do some sort of time capsule of their experiences or blogs or something, but I thought it would be fun. No one's ever done a sort of video game about the experience, and I'm assuming it's going to be quite an experience. So
I bet it will, and I look forward to hearing all about it, either while it's going on or afterwards, whatever makes the most sense. But yeah, sorry to spring that on you, but I've been thinking about it. It might be a good idea to talk about at some point.
Yep.
So we'll probably do 2 more games before he goes off on his break, or on his hike rather. So you'll be able to see like your images. You've been kind of posting to Instagram more. So
I'll put all that stuff out there. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll all be out there.
If anyone wants to, I might even have I'm going to put up probably a web page, a landing web page for stuff too. If people really do care about seeing A, if I make it, and B, what kind of pain I'm in as I go. So it's about 20 plus miles a day you need to backpack. So
that's a lot. Yeah. I mean, I'm more interested in the pain part, but
I knew. Yeah.
Yeah, but for sure.
I'll have a special section for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, well, in the meantime, you can find the show on the web at devgameclub.com, and, of course, send us your mails at devgameclub@gmail.com. We do, of course, as alluded to any number of times, love to get your reviews on the podcast app of your choice, but especially Apple Podcasts, which has like more than 50% of the market still, so it's a good way to reach new listeners. You can find the podcast on Twitter at DevGameClub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end. And you've also been more active on Twitter lately, I've noticed.
I have been a little bit more active. That's because I'm not working. So I'm at Brett_Duville there. Who knows? I might disappear at any point. I occasionally just delete all my tweets and disappear for a while. But you can also find me streaming weeknights or whatever we're playing on weekends at twitch.tv/Brett Duville. No underscore in that one. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks again to Kirk, and good night.
Good night.